So I get asked how to lubricate a sewing machine. So I'm going to talk about how to lubricate your sewing machine. I'm going to start with this industrial, but I'm going to do a home machine. This is a manual lubricated machine. I'm also going to talk a little bit about automatic lubricating sewing machines. So if you're going to lubricate a sewing machine, you're going to need sewing machine oil. Sewing machine oil is what I recommend you use. I've bought a lot of used sewing machines, and some of them have been really gunked up. They get frozen in a way. I don't know exactly what the reason is for that, but I have kind of developed a working theory that if you use the wrong kind of oil, it seems completely plausible to me that people will use other kinds of oil over the many years that these machines sit around in garages and basements and whatnot. Just people not really knowing what to do, so they figure any oil will work. I think if you use the wrong oil, after 20 or 30 years, that stuff's just going to set up. I think if you use sewing machine oil, that problem is minimized and perhaps non-existent. I've had some old machines that weren't gunked up at all. And I think if you just use sewing machine oil, one, you're going to protect your machine the way it's intended to protect the machine by lubricating it. Two, you're not going to get a machine that gets all locked up after some time of non-use. So what I want you to see here is it says sewing machine oil. It's a very specific oil for sewing machines. And maybe it seems overly simplified, but when you lubricate a sewing machine, you want to use sewing machine oil. So I'm going to have a link down in the description for this sewing machine oil. If you need to find some, it's inexpensive. Also, if you have an automatic lubrication machine, you're going to need more than this. And I'll have a link for a gallon of sewing machine oil, which would be more than enough for any one sewing machine. The nice thing about this is it has this spout, and that allows you to get to the holes and also inside the machine. So I'm going to open up some of these areas, and then in that way you can reach in through the hole with that spout and apply the oil specifically to the points that it needs to be applied to. This machine is marked in red wherever it needs to be lubricated. And so if you have a machine that is marked in red on a hole, then that means it needs to be lubricated. There's another one right there. Some machines, the old Singers, they would say oil and they'd have an arrow or a line. But many machines have various holes that are not marked in any way. These holes are directly over internal components, and when you drop oil down through them, the oil lands on those various pieces that need to be lubricated. And so these types of things are the types of lubrication that you'll do more frequently. In a factory setting, when these ran, for 18 hours or whatever, you might need to oil them once a day. I don't oil my machines that often, but my machines don't get a lot of use, and when they do get used, I'm running them very slowly. So in that situation, they just don't need as much lubrication. So use and speed are a very big factor in how often you need to lube your sewing machine. Now on this machine, you can see in here also, there's even some red points inside. That's a little unusual. Most machines are not marked inside where they need to be lubricated. That was kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to use this machine, to show that you do need to get inside these machines and lubricate the various moving parts. So if your machine is not marked, how do you know where to lubricate it? Alright, let's talk a little bit about the purpose of lubrication. So if you want to do an experiment, press your hands together with some force and rub them. And just rub them for about 30 seconds, and you'll notice your hands start to heat up, and that's friction. So now imagine that you put some baby oil on your hands and you do the same experiment. They're just going to be real slippery, and you're not going to develop any heat because lubrication reduces friction. So That's what's happening when you lubricate your machine. You've got all these moving parts inside your machine. And where moving parts touch other moving parts, or moving parts touch stationary parts, anytime there's two parts rubbing against each other, that's where you need lubrication. Basically, if you just lubricate all the moving parts where they touch other moving parts, you're going to be good. So if you don't have a manual, which I recommend you check your manual and do what your manual says. But if you don't have a manual, which a lot of times I don't, and often I've seen pictures of sewing machines and it literally points at like 80 different places and you can't really tell where they're pointing. They're just pointing at the places where one moving part moves against another part. And so you just need to get a little bit of oil on there. It just takes a drop in each place. So I just come in here and hit every hole. I like to tip the machine back and lubricate everything in the bottom. Even though there's this hole, which is going to be lubricating something on the bottom, I do believe that there's always parts under there you can't get to from the top. Again, there are these holes, and so the oil goes in these holes. Not all sewing machines are going to have holes like that, but just a drop on each one. And then here, this fork is got a dot on it. And so, let's see, if I move it, and you can kind of see some movement there. So you can infer that anywhere there's movement between this piece and that piece, you're going to need to get some oil in there. So when you don't have dots, a good method for determining where to oil a machine is to just rotate it by hand and find the movement. You'll just put oil anywhere one part is moving on another. Here's a part right here. There is a pivot on a shaft right here. You can see that moves a little bit, and there's a hole in there to oil that, and it's not marked in red. This one up here is marked, that one down there is not. Now I don't know why that is, but I do know that that hole also needs lubrication. So I'll get that one too. Right here is a pivot point. Again, just move it. You can see some movement there. Two parts are moving against one another, so oil that. One drop of oil. Right here is a wick. If you ever see one of those, you kind of just saturate that. This right here is kind of a cup that clamshells around a set of gears. A lot of machines will have inside this column a belt that comes over the top of this shaft and goes down to the bottom of the machine and turns a shaft that runs the length of the bottom of the machine to drive the feed dogs and the hook. Some machines, however, will have a gearbox at the top and the bottom with the shaft that runs straight down. If on your machine you do have something like this, you might want to open it up and take a look in there and see what you got. It's pretty easy and it's pretty cheap. I've got another video where I'll show you how to open up these cowls, clean them, and repack them. If you're interested, look in the description for a link to that video. So there's a few things in here. If you just kind of move your controls while you're looking in this hole, you'll see where different points of movement are at. And I can't show you all those points in here, but just know that there's some more than what I can show you that are deeper inside. And by moving levers and rotating the machine, basically I'm just looking for any place where two pieces are moving against each other, and that's where I oil them. There's always a lot of things in the end of the machine to kind of look at. I usually do it whenever I first get a machine. and that'll last a while. But if I go in here and point right there, there's like a sponge and some felt. You need to make sure sponges, felts, and wicks are saturated, so it doesn't hurt to just visually kind of fill that up. This one's pretty good. I don't need to put a lot of oil on that because I've already done it, you know, somewhat recently. Move your machine and just find those points. Here's a shaft that slides inside of a bushing. So just put a dot on there. Down here is another shaft inside a bushing. Put a dot there. And we're good. So even if you're dealing with a home machine or an older machine, there's going to be several places to lubricate your machine, and there are these holes. So again, if you have a manual, that's going to help you identify which holes to put oil in. But if you don't have a manual, there are ways to infer which holes to use. On this bobbin winder, there's a shaft in there, and so I know that this hole is going to lubricate this shaft so that this spins easily. So a drop in there. Some of these holes are threaded, and so those typically aren't lubrication holes. If you can look at the bottom of your machine, you can just do the same thing we did on the Bernina and just rotate the machine, and anywhere there's movement, you're going to lubricate those points. I'm glad I'm doing this video because I haven't lubricated this machine in a little bit. I don't use it very often. But while I'm here, it's good. There is a point on the hook. You put 1 drop of oil on the hook race. And that's just where the bobbin case slides inside the hook. There's a little track in there, and so that needs to be oiled. But right here, there's a shaft inside the casing here. I'm feeling on the top, and I can feel a couple of holes that are directly inside of these castings. I'll move this machine up, and maybe you can kind of see that right here are those 2 holes. So I know that these are oil holes, and these 2 are. Now these 2 are threaded, so that's for attachments. So there's a hole on this shaft. Here's one. Wanted to show you this hole right here. You can see that it's kind of funnel shaped, and that is an indication that you might need to put oil into that particular hole. Now this hole here has threads in it, so that's not an oil hole, that's a hole for a screw. This hole here with the funnel is directly over that main shaft. That's a way to know that it's going right to that shaft and the bushing. So put a little oil in that cup. Here's another one. It's over this main shaft. So we'll put some in there. There's one on the end of this shaft, and on the other end there's also a hole over here. And that lubricates that shaft. And this shaft is what holds the cams that are just permanently mounted inside this machine. I like to oil gears. Yeah, that's basically it for the top of this machine. So this home machine is basically like the Bernina. If you get in the end here, you're going to see some shafts and some parts that rotate on one another. And then you might be able to find a hole that is for oil. And I also just hit any pivot point, any point that touches another part and slides together is where I oil. So I'm happy with that. I'll put it back together. This is an automatic lubrication machine. You can tell by the fact that there is this sight window here. And this window doesn't have any fluid in it right now. But when the machine runs, there's a pump that is down inside the oil sump that's underneath this machine. It's a pan full of oil. There's a pump down there and it pumps oil up through the machine, and while that's happening you'll see oil run into this sight glass and then back out. You'll see oil flowing through it, and in that way you know that you have oil pressure. Very similar to a car that has a gauge, but instead of a gauge you just have this window that you can see oil flowing in, and as long as you have oil flowing then you know you've got oil and oil pressure and everything's a-okay. The other way to know for sure is to look underneath the machine, and holy cow, that oil is dirty. I don't know what's going on here, but I don't like it. So I'm going to take the oil out of here and discard this oil. It shouldn't be green. I don't know why it's green. It should be clear. Let's get that oil out of there first. So I need some sort of device that I can extract this oil. Some of these pans will have a plug in the bottom, and you just take out the plug and the oil will run right out and you just catch it in the oil pan. But this one doesn't have a plug in it, and I don't want to take the pan clear out of the machine. It's attached to the table. So I'm going to make just a down and dirty oil extraction device out of some stuff I got laying around the house. A hard-sided container and a hose. I push the hose into the bottom. Now a second hole. Cyanoacrylate, super glue, baking soda, this stuff is thick and gross. It's really needs to be replaced. Alright, that's pretty good. So now the rest of it I'll just wipe out with some paper. This is part of the foot lift. Oh, look what I just found. The plug. Well, that probably would have been a little easier. Carefully remove this gasket. This gasket looks to be in good shape. I'll clean it up also. And then under it, it's all dirty. So basically, I'm just cleaning everything that's dirty. Okay, good. We're all cleaned up now. I'll go over one more time kind of all the parts here. So here's the plug. So this is where you drain the oil. You just, use your jar or whatever, hold it underneath the machine, open this up, let the oil run out. This is a component which is part of the foot lift that you operate with your knee. Then there's a gasket, and when you set the machine down, the bottom of the machine seals against this gasket. So there is a reservoir over here, and then as you fill this with oil, it begins to rise, and there's some marks over here. Right here are some wicks. When the machine is in the down position, these wicks will be resting in oil, and so therefore carrying oil to the various positions that these wicks run to. And then right here is the pump of the machine, and it sits in the deepest part of the oil over here. And there are various tubes and whatnot and plumbing that go throughout the machine, and this pump pumps it from down here into the machine, and then the oil that gets pumped up into the machine then runs back down into this sump. So when you go to fill this up, you need to fill it to a certain level, and right over here on this particular pan are some marks, and so you want the top of the oil level to be somewhere between these two marks. Maybe you can see the two marks here, low and high. When I fill the reservoir up, I'll just stop when the top of the oil level is between these two marks. And so when the top of the oil is between those two marks, you know that when you run the machine, the pump is going to be deep enough in the oil that it'll have enough to pump. So I've mentioned using the proper type of oil, and I've shown an example, and here's another one. I want you to know that brand is not what's important here. What is important is that it is commonly referred to as Lily White sewing machine oil or just sewing machine oil. The brand is not all that important. Now maybe some brands are better than others. I don't know that. I never have noticed a difference. Any sewing machine oil I've got is good. So it's not the brand that's most important, it's the type. So if you go to get this oil in the link in the description, you don't have to get this oil. You can find your own oil. I just do that for your convenience, and I get a little kickback at no extra cost to you. I hope you can see the oil. It's hard to get a shot of this, but as the oil rises, it moves up to those lines. Alright, so that's low. And if you looked in here, I mean, that's when you're going to want to add, is when it gets down to the low. I'll just put a little bit more in and let that rise up. Now if you looked in here and check that, that's a good level. Anywhere in between those lines is good. So I'm going to put just a little bit more. And I'm going to call that good. So now a little before and after, this is what an oil pan should look like. I should have changed it a long time ago. This is what you want your oil and oil pan to look like. Nice, clean, clear oil. No debris. So this sight glass is a way to know while you're operating the machine that you have enough oil and that your pump is working. So it's just a way to visualize your oil system is working. So whether you have an industrial machine or a home machine, you use the same kind of oil. Concept is the same. There are parts that touch each other and move against one another, and now those are the points that need lubrication. And if you have an automatic lubrication machine, you fill up a reservoir and wicks carry the oil to those points. Just because you have an automatic lubrication machine doesn't mean that every single point gets lubricated. Again, it's important to check your manual. If you have a manual for your machine, that's the place to start. If you don't have a manual and you have points that are marked in red usually, sometimes they're marked, older machines will say oil and a line. But if they're not marked, I talked a little bit about how you can tell an oil hole from a screw hole and kind of where you'll see oil holes at. Behind an oil hole is a place that needs to be lubricated, and so sometimes you can tell by looking underneath the machine. If you look at a hole and it just goes through to nowhere, well, that's not an oil hole. Too much oil won't hurt your machine. The main problem with that is now your machine's all oily, could be dripping out of the machine, and it could be getting on your legs or inside your cabinet or on your sewing project. If you do put too much oil on, you can just wait a little bit for it to run out and then wipe everything off. Once you get your machine cleaned up, then you won't get oil on your projects. So that's the main drawback to too much oil, is it'll get on your project. Just a drop on each of these locations is all you need, and sometimes a drop's too much. But like I said, you can always just wipe that stuff off and then you're good to go. It's very important to use the right kind of oil. Again, I have a link in the description. So lubricating machine is nothing to be scared of, and it's a pretty easy concept. And hopefully I've given you enough information to where you can lubricate your machine. If you like this sort of thing, consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks a lot for watching.